I can start by introducing myself, but I think one of the things that I wanted to set the stage for you today is that this industry is an evolving and expanding industry. And since I've been in industry since 2013 in Australia, it has literally boomed from having about 200 to 300 people in the National Australian Information Security Association to having thousands of people across the country and actually joining the industry and doing a whole heap of different important things. I guess the message here is we are an ecosystem, we are a family, and we all have different skill sets that we need to bring to the table in order for us to be effective to combat cybercrime and to be able to combat the advanced threats that we're seeing in our world. So by way of introduction, I'm Gergana Winzer, and I'm the national lead for the mid-market at KPMG for cyber. And what that means is I work very consistently with a lot of small, medium organizations. And most of those organizations are in different industries. And they do have a lot of issues when it comes down to cyber. One of the things that has struck me over the last year or so is how many of those businesses actually do not have the right controls in place in order for them to be able to respond and then ultimately recover from a cyber incident. And that is why what I do, I feel, is extremely important. And we've seen some crazy stuff in the media recently with Medibank and Optus and a few others having incredible tough time as cyber professionals to be able to recover from what's been happening and a lot of stress. So let's take a moment to acknowledge that our industry is not all great and fantastic. There's a lot of stress around being actually a cyber professional today. So let me check in with you. How many of you here are technical cyber people? Put your hand up if you're a technical cyber person. And what that means is network architecture. Anything else? Right. And how many of you are in governance, risk, and compliance? Put your hand up if you are in governance, risk. So I can see. Awesome. Great. Awesome. So this topic is going to be very relevant to you from multiple aspects. And what I'm bringing to you today is experience on the ground with a number of organizations over the last 10 and so years. So what I'm showing here to you is a bit of a busy slide. Many of you may have seen it, some may have not. But what it's showing is basically how persistent and how terrible the cyber attacks in our countries have been over the years and how they have been significantly increasing year on year. And as you can see, the biggest victims of cyber attacks in our country are not the high profile organizations. It's not, the big banks or the big telcos and insurance companies that we've been seeing recently being compromised. It's actually the small, medium organizations. And what that means for our economy is that those organizations have a lot less ability to combat and to recover and to respond to cyber attacks. And so they succumb to a number of different things. In some instances, they pay ransomware, which they should not be paying, but because they don't have other means, they actually end up paying it. And those organizations end up also not being able to recover properly. Some of them close shop. People lose their jobs, right? So if you look at some of these numbers here, 33% of businesses in Australia have actually experienced a cybercrime of some sort, of some shape and form. And then the average time currently to resolve an attack is about 23 days. And it's not me saying that, it's data that we've been collecting over the last few years together with Home Affairs and the Smart Online, Stay Smart Online Australia. But what really interesting number for me is that 53% of the cost is on detection and recovery of the cyber attacks. And what that tells me is that number one, we are not good at detecting cyber attacks when we should be able to detect them. And number two, we're actually not very efficient when we recover our organizations from cyber attacks. And that can be, can have multitude of different reasons. One of those being the lack of policies and procedures, the lack of connecting people to technology and to processes. And so from that perspective, there's a lot of work to be done in all those three domains of what cyber really means today. The average cost per attack here. And one of the bigger ones, as you can see, is a malicious insider. And so what that means is that we have more and more people being actually targeted and being able to suffer, not being able, but like suffering a cyber attack because there's somebody from the inside who is doing something they should not be doing. And that actually, when we talk about insider threat, we talk about the fact that insider threat can be two types. One is a malicious insider threat, which is somebody who is maliciously, targeting the organization from within for different reasons. They may be bitter because they had a disagreement with their boss and they have enough data to actually exfiltrate and sell that data or to do something else. Or they may actually be being targeted via social, channels and social engineering and become that way a target. And then all of a sudden from the inside, someone has taken over their credentials. And I actually have a great example of that. I was working with a portfolio of VC companies recently, and one of them had a very senior finance person, credentials being actually compromised. And what happened was the attackers went and changed the bank details of a very big transfer of money. And basically the money went into the wrong account. Now, when they found that out a few days later, they actually went back to the bank and said, well, that's a fraud, like somebody did this fraudulent transaction. But when the bank went back, they actually saw that there was a log, which that particular person have changed the details of. So they couldn't do anything about it. So you can imagine for a small, medium organization what that means. They have lost all of a sudden a huge amount of money. They may not be able to pay their salaries of their people, and they can't actually prove that they have been really attacked. Now, obviously, we were able to look at that and investigate it and prove it, but you can imagine the stress they need to go through in order for them to get on the other side. So some really real examples. Let me see, show of hand, if you guys are working in a small, medium organization, put your hands up. Right. And if you're working for a very large organization that has a lot of small, medium organizations helping them with something and providing services to them, put your hand up. So you understand how important that is, because it's not about that one organization, it's about the ecosystem. Moving forward, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is the threat actors and who they really are. And there's a bit of a definition around them, because I think it's important to understand who are we really dealing with and why our profession is so important. Of course, we have people who have malicious intent, and those are the ruthless entrepreneurs or the cyber criminals. We have people who are activists and they stand for a political cause. In some instances, a very valid one, but executed in the wrong way, so the hacktivists. Then we have nation states, and those ones are extremely interesting nowadays because we have friends and we have frenemies, and then we have enemies in Australia. And, we've been seeing a lot of the attackers coming also from countries that we would have never suspected would actually be attacking us. So these are the so-called frenemies. And then you have insiders, which we just spoke about a little bit. But the thing that I feel is really relevant to the conversation today is that in the context of an organization, what really matters is really three things. And those three things are, is my data secure? Are my people safe? And am I able to do business? Can I be disrupted if something was to happen? We're going to unpack that a little bit more. But let me take you through some of the cyber threat actors. And I have taken a sample. There's many of them, 13 prevalently across the world, that are making a lot of and creating a lot of issues for organizations and entire countries for that matter. But let me kind of give you a bit of a breakdown, and I'm not going to stay here for long because I want to focus on other topics. But Lazarus, who here have heard of Lazarus? Yeah, exactly. They're very famous. I'm not going to go in length in covering them, but yeah, extremely interesting type of organization that has been doing a lot of different terrible things, and is particularly famous with the big Bangladesh bank hack that happened, I think, in 2016. Then we have Dark Hollow, Mobilium, Silverfish, you name it. those guys are also interesting characters, and they've been also creating a lot of issues around the globe for a very long time now. And then ultimately we have the equation group, which no one really knows if it's a real group or if it's a togetherness of tools. But bottom line, they've been creating some pretty crazy things, such as installing a dark, dark vault inside your firmware, and then being able to reinfect your computer, even if you have formatted it completely. So really interesting kind of situation there, right? And now let me take you back to that ecosystem that we spoke about at the beginning of this session. And why is that so important? Because we have a huge, interesting landscape happening, and that is only bound to grow. So far, we have no idea what's going to happen in the future. But one thing is for sure, we're still going to have, multiple new technologies emerging. We're looking now at quantum computing and AI, and we're looking at so many new things emerging that will be making the difference for how we as cyber professionals approach our profession and approach our duties of care. But interestingly, we have still legacy IT environments. And if you talk about legacy IT environments, they're actually still there. Lots of organizations do not have the means, the money. They don't have the appetite or even the maturity to understand that they need to be doing something about those legacy systems. But in some instances, they can't do anything because those systems simply are so old, they cannot be converted in any meaningful way into a new system. So we have to protect them. We have to do something about it, right? Then you've got your operational technologies. You have obviously Internet of Things, and it's all bound to grow multiple folds. I'm sure you have seen a lot of statistics on this topic particularly. Then we have the threat landscape that I spoke about, which is ever expanding. And the things that I have listed here are basically the ones that really are bothering Australian organizations in particular. And I have a large sample because I work with them. My team is on the ground working with hundreds of those on a yearly basis. And what has emerged is, because we've done a bit of a research around what is the likelihood and the impact if any of those threat scenarios was to occur and to eventuate. And we're looking at about 38, in some instances to 40% of likelihood in 12 months of those organizations being hit. On such a large sample, that is actually tremendous. And it's a little bit worrying and scary, to be honest with you. Then on the other side, we have our risks, and the risks we encounter in the small, medium organizations, but across the economy are always the same. Is the financial loss, which I gave you an example about before. We have the data loss, and we've been seeing that in the media over the last few months going absolutely crazy because of everything that's been happening. Reputational damage, it's absolutely incredible. Have you guys heard the new ads that Optus is putting out there? Who has heard like their radio ads? Yeah, exactly, right? Then we have the biggest one, which I think is some of those that people don't really realize, and that's the operational disruption. And the operational disruption, I recently had an organization that had to move a server, like a physical server, because they were not on the cloud, they had everything on-prem, got hacked. So they had to move their backup server from Melbourne to the Gold Coast. And what that meant was they had to disrupt their operations for quite a few days in order for them to then be able to plug it back on and be able to operate. But if we put that to hospitals, if we put that to critical infrastructure, we can imagine what that means for many people who receive vital and important services, right? Then we have the health and safety, and I'm not going to speak at length of that, but we've been seeing more and more issues around that, and indeed the hospitals is a great example of it. Now, let me speak a little bit about the regulatory environment in Australia. We are as a country waking up to that reality, and we are doing more and more. And there's some enhancement coming from the Privacy Commissioner on the privacy principles. There's enhancement on the Critical Infrastructure Act, and there's an expansion happening as we speak. There's a risk management, consultation going on at the moment. And we also have a number of different things that are happening across different industries in order for them to uplift the maturity of their cyber posture and uplift the maturity of their cybersecurity capabilities. And that's happening as we speak. I personally feel that many of those organizations are not necessarily equipped with enough time and money for them to be able to really do something that really matters. And so that is the quest I personally am on, and I invite you all to consider. how we as an industry can really enable and help organizations of small size that are part of our supply chain, for them to be actually empowered to deal with cyber risk and cyber attacks and be able to recover. Or in other words, how can they be resilient? I think the biggest trends that we are facing as industry is not how many threat actors are out there, is not how many breaches we're going to have, because we're going to have many, let me tell you that. How many of you doubt that there will be many breaches? Nobody, right? But the biggest thing is to focus on what really matters, and that's resilience. How quickly can we bounce back? How quickly can we do something about it? How quickly can we get out of there? And I've jotted down a few questions that if you were a cyber professional, you should be asking your organization. But even if you're not a cyber professional, you should be asking your management team and your cyber professionals that work for you. And those are, to what extent am I aware of my critical processes, my critical and important data, and obviously my systems, my critical systems? To what extent do I have a cybersecurity plan or roadmap to meet the challenges, right? And when we talk about roadmap, let me take a step back, because one thing I personally have been missing in the small, medium organizations, but also at some large end of town organization, is actually having a strategy, and having a strategy that makes sense, cybersecurity specific strategy that makes sense, and it's actually connected to the organizational overall strategy. Because if I don't know what I'm trying to achieve, how am I going to ever achieve it? How am I ever going to be able to get there? So strategy is definitely missing. We are still seeing cyber as a tactical item somewhere in the IT bucket, right? And many organizations, I would dare to say probably 75 to 80% of the organizations in Australia are still using IT budgets for cybersecurity. And that's not okay. They're two different competing priorities in many instances, and they do have different outcomes, right? Number three, how confident am I that I know when I have been breached? Again, we have so many cybersecurity services out there, managed security services, security operations centers that organizations can either do themselves or build themselves or acquire as a service. And we still yet are not cracking that particular nut. It's one of those that will need some more time to be cracked. Managed detection and response is one of those. Extended detection and response could be another one that we need to start focusing a bit more on. But I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot about those exciting things today. How quickly can I restore my organization's critical process? We spoke about that at length. And then, am I aware of my regulatory obligations? And those regulatory obligations, can they kill me, or can they give me something that I can become competitive with? Can I commercialize my obligations? Can I become really aware that whatever I'm putting in terms of budgets and energy to become compliant or to become aligned to a framework can have some sort of a return on investment? And that's from me. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And the one thing I wanted to leave you with is we are an ecosystem. Together we can do so little. Actually, alone we can do so little, and together we can do so much. So thank you.